The Mandalorian Armor. Chapter 16. What exactly is the history between you and the Shell Huts? Zuckuss wasn't asking just to pass the time. Sitting at last on the surface of Circumtorre, surrounded by the durasteel-plated huts and, even worse, their various guards and mercenaries, he felt no less endangered than before. It just keeps getting worse, Zuckuss mused gloomily to himself. Pretty soon he'd be wishing that everyone on this intrepid little team had gotten blown to spiraling, whistling atoms. I mean, the way that the negotiator talked, Boba Fett stood with his arms crossed, watching the Shell Hut's customs inspectors poking through the interior of the slave one. They weren't looking for contraband, which was something that the Shell Huts, like all the members of the species, had no aversion to, as long as they got their piece of the action, but were combing the ship and its passengers for undeclared weaponry. Without his usual panoply of rocket launchers and other means of destruction, Fett looked even more dangerous, oddly enough. As though his simmering anger were some newly aroused lethal force, provoked by the intrusion on his personal domain. Huts say all sorts of things. Boba Fett didn't turn toward Zuckuss as he spoke. There's a lot of it you can safely ignore. A lot of creatures in the galaxy believe that all the Hutties are efficient businessmen, with nothing but credits on their minds. But they're not. They spend too much time brooding about the past, keeping old scores, bearing grudges. That kind of emotion always gets in the way of true rationality. Nobody would ever make that kind of assessment, Zuckuss figured, of Boba Fett. The more time he spent anywhere near Fett, the more he was impressed and appalled by the cold calculations taking place inside that visored helmet. Even over something like the team disarming itself for its landing on the Shell Hut's world, if Boba Fett was willing to go along with that, it must mean his intricately worked-out plans included this factor, accounted for it in some way. We might make it back out of here alive, thought Zuckuss. Or at least some of us might. The plans that he had let himself become part of, Kratos' plans, called for one death out here, if not more. It seemed kind of specific, though. What Gita said, Zuckuss tried again. When he was talking about what happened before, is there some kind of old score to settle between you and the Shell Huts? The customs inspector's multi-legged droids, bristling with inspection probes and energy level meters, continued their inspection of the slave one. Their black spidery forms could be seen through the ship's open hatches and up inside the transparent shielding of the cockpit. One of the inspectors lay crumpled in pieces, a few lights still forlornly blinking, on the thrust-scarred landing dock. That one had been a little too brusque in frisking the Trandoshan boss for any concealed weapons, and had paid the price in quick bolt-snapping disassembly. Nothing you have to worry about, said Boba Fett. It's a personal thing. Actually, between me and Gita, there was a time when he wasn't a mere negotiator, being sent out on those kinds of errands to ships seeking permission to land. He was very high up in the Shell Hut hierarchy. That was why he was in charge of the design and construction of the on-planet terminal and diplomatic reception site, basically everything you see around you here. Fett gestured with one raised hand. Past the landing dock's archways could be seen a complex of interlinked spires and domes. His budget allowed for a nearly unlimited expenditure of capital, including the hiring of one of the top freelance architects in the galaxy. A man named M. de Graves. I've heard of him. Zuckuss actually had, though he couldn't remember from just where. There may be better ones, but if there are, they'd be working for Emperor Palpatine, or someone like Prince Shizor. Exclusively. So Graves was the top of the line for the Shell Huts, and Gita knew it. That's why he hired him. The only problem was that Gita had other plans for Graves once the project was completed. Unfortunately for Gita, Graves was no fool. He knew how dangerous it can be working for any kind of hut. They don't like paying up, and they like having things that no one else can have. If they can't buy exclusivity, they have other ways of achieving it. And that's what Graves found out, that when this job was done, he wouldn't be taking on any others. Fett glanced over at Zuckuss. Ever? That's kind of cold, said Zuckuss. Having somebody killed right after he's done some great job for you. Get used to it. It happens to bounty hunters as well, if they're not careful. Boba Fett gave a slow nod. This galaxy is full of treachery. There's no one you can really trust. Words to live by, thought Zuckuss. Or die. So what happened to this architect, this Graves person? Did Gita manage to have him killed or not? Not. Satisfaction was audible in that single word from Boba Fett. Because Gravis was just a little bit smarter than Gita. Smart enough to contact me and propose a mutually satisfactory business arrangement. Like what? You don't need to know all the details. Boba Fett continued to watch the customs inspectors stalking around inside the Slave One. At least not yet. Let's just say that Gravis and I had everything worked out well before his work here on Circumtorre was completed, so that Gita and his hench creatures never had a shot at him. Essentially, Gravis put out a bounty on himself. A nice fat one, which I was only too happy to collect by making a quick raid here and snatching him away right out from Gita's hands. That's the main reason why the Shell Hut's security procedures are so tight now. They don't want a repeat of that kind of action. Makes them look foolish. Huts can't stand that. Pretty clever, Zuckuss nodded in appreciation. The only one that winds up screwed is this Gita. The architect gets to keep his life, and you get the credits. Smart. I got more than that out of it. Zuckuss studied the other bounty hunter in puzzlement. What more would you want out of it than credits? He couldn't imagine any other incentive for someone like Fett. An investment, so to speak. Boba Fett watched the Shell Hut's customs inspection droids emerging from the ship. That pays off later, in a big way. There wasn't time for Zuckuss to ask what that meant. The inspectors spider-legged their way toward the waiting bounty hunters. A couple of the droids lagged behind and began picking up the scattered wreckage of their forcibly disassembled companion, the broken circuits of its main sensory input-output box still buzzing and moaning. Thank you for your cooperation. The lead inspector droid halted in front of Boba Fett. Our examination of your craft shows no hidden armaments of a force sufficient to disturb the peace and tranquility of Circumtorre. Zuckuss would have been surprised if the inspector droids had found anything like that. He and IG-88 Bosk had still been unhelpfully sulking over having to lay down his own weapons, had assisted Boba Fett in removing either whole systems or essential parts of them from the Slave One's arsenal, and then packing and sealing them into the coded access freight container that was now in orbit above the surface of Circumtorre, awaiting Fett's return. When that procedure had been completed, the ship had been rendered as defenseless, and more significantly for the Shell Huts, offenseless as any unarmed cargo shuttle plodding among the stars. The bounty hunters' personal weapons had been another matter, those they had brought with them to Circumtorre, handing them over directly to the customs inspection droids. Here's your receipt for the items we are holding in storage for you. One of the lead inspectors pried open a slender pouch beneath its multi-lensed eyes and extracted a miniature holo projector. If you'd care to check it over and make sure that we haven't forgotten anything. Boba Fett took the device and thumbed it on. The shimmering visual field winked into existence in front of him and Zuckuss, with a scrolling depiction of the bounty hunter's various weapons. It was a long list. Boba Fett gave it no more than a cursory glance before extinguishing the hologram. Looks complete. Very well. The lead inspector extended one of its optic stalks straight up and swiveled its small lens around to see how the others were coming along with the bits and pieces of the one that Bosk had taken apart. A few last segments were being tucked into an inert mesh sack, from which the droid's muffled complaints were barely audible. The inspector returned its attention to Boba Fett. If you'll hold on to that and present it to the landing master when you're ready to leave, all items will be returned to you. A dark oil stain and a couple of glittering, broken transistors were all that were left on the surface of the dock. It's been a pleasure to serve you. Canned formalities had always sounded even more canned when they came from droids. Zuckuss was glad to see the customs inspection droids leave, stalking their way delicately across the landing dock, dragging their bagged comrade behind themselves. As the inspection squadron left the landing dock, Bosk came striding over, followed by IG-88. The droid looked as unemotional as ever, but burning resentment showed in Bosk's eyes. So this is your great plan? He made a quick, dismissive gesture at the blaster holster hanging empty by his side. Now we're stuck down here on the Shell Hut's planet, and if they decide to send their thugs around to kill us, there won't be a thing we'll be able to do about it. He shook his head in disgust. I don't see why you need a team to go along with you. If you just wanted to get yourself knocked off, you could have done it on your own just as easily. Boba Fett regarded the Trandoshan in silence. He said finally, I'm going to give you something free. That doesn't happen very often. Even when it's just good advice, I usually let other creatures learn by just suffering the consequences of their actions. Yeah, Bosk sneered at him. So what's your good advice? Stop whining. Before you really get me irritated. Fett turned toward the other bounty hunters. Let's get going. Gita sent me a message while the ship was being inspected. The shell huts have already prepared a reception for us. I just bet they have, grumbled Bosk under his breath. Fett ignored the remark if he had heard it at all. IG-88 crossed in front of Zuckuss, following after Boba Fett, and toward the open-topped ground shuttle that would take them into the center of Circumtor's administrative complex. Zuckuss drew back even farther as the massive shape of Daharhan trod heavily forward, the barrel of the laser cannon now rendered inert and harmless, slanting disconsolately, the tip of its muzzle almost scraping against the landing dock's surface. The stilled weapons tracking systems were switched off, as though the half-humanoid, half-mechanical creature was some slow beast following the voice of the master that had blinded it. What do you think's going to happen? The voice startled Zuckuss. He snapped his head around and saw Bosk standing next to him, leaning down to speak close to his ear. Zuckuss had been immersed too deep in his thoughts, reflecting on how the altered Daharhan looked like the last survivor of some otherwise extinct saurian species, dragging its age-heavy bones and rusting metal armor to the burial ground of its kin. Bosk had stepped beside him while he was still wondering what had been the point of bringing Daharhan along on this job if Boba Fett had known all along that the laser cannon's core, Daharhan's spirit, or as much of one as he might have possessed, would need to be extracted. It struck Zuckuss as a needlessly cruel thing to have done to an old comrade, something that he would never have imagined Fett capable of doing. Don't ask me. Zuckuss glanced over at Bosk and gave a shrug, lifting his gloved hands to indicate his complete bafflement. I haven't got a clue about what's going on. Things had seemed a lot simpler back at the Bounty Hunters Guild when he'd agreed to become part of Kradosk's plans, not that those were anything he felt like telling to Bosk. They'd only gotten more complicated since then. And dangerous. The confidence he'd felt at one time that he'd survive all this just by sticking close to Boba Fett had been seriously eroded. Fett packing his personal arsenal of blasters and rocket launchers was one thing. A disarmed Fett leading all of the team right into the center of Fett's grudge-bearing enemies was another. Maybe Bosk is right, mused Zuckuss. Maybe Fett is going to get us all killed. Another thought struck him. Maybe that had been Kradosk's plan all along. The old Trandoshan hadn't been out just to get his own son eliminated, but a couple more of the guild's young upstarts as well. Zuckuss could see why Kradosk and some of the other guild elders would want to get rid of the coldly efficient droid, IG-88. But he would have been surprised to find that anyone thought that he himself was at that level. And even if that were Kradosk's plan, where would Boba Fett hook up with it? Was Fett just leading Bosk and the other bounty hunters into a prearranged trap, which would mean that somehow Kradosk had gotten the shell huts in on the scheme? How likely was that? Or had the galaxy's smartest and toughest bounty hunter somehow been fooled as well? And Fett was about to get eliminated along with the rest of the team? Or the brain behind the insectoid eyes started to throb painfully as more and more possibilities swirled within. If he did get killed here on Circumtor, Zuckuss hoped it wouldn't be before he had at least figured out part of what was going on. He was beginning to doubt the wisdom of having even wanted to become a bounty hunter. I suppose, growled Bosk, we'll find out. One way or another. Maybe. The others of the team were waiting beside the ground shuttle. Zuckuss nodded toward them. We better get going. He conquered his reluctance enough to start walking. Even before the shuttle lifted on its repulsor beams and slid toward the shell hut's spired buildings, Zuckuss had a revelation. He could see his face mask, air tubes dangling, reflected in the dark metal of Daharhan's silent, impotent laser cannon. It doesn't matter, realized Zuckuss suddenly. Whether we have weapons or not. Whatever was going to happen, which of them would die and which of them would live, would happen whether they were ready for it or not. There was one of them who might be ready. Zuckuss looked toward Boba Fett, sitting in the front of the shuttle. If anybody was going to survive, it would be him. That thought, even with all its embodied certainty, didn't make Zuckuss feel any better. Gita came floating up, his welcoming smile nearly wide enough to split his waddled face in two. At last! The crab-like mechanical hands beneath the rivet-studded cylinder spread expansively. Now you will have a chance to truly partake of our hospitality. We're not here to enjoy ourselves. At the head of the team of bounty hunters, Boba Fett stopped and gazed around the grand reception hall of the Shell Huts. This is strictly business for us. I would appreciate it if we could get straight to it. All in good time, my dear Fett. The tapering end of the cylinder pointed toward the farther reaches of the hall, its high-vaulted roof interlaced with golden traceries and ornamental center bosses. You are too dismissive of both pleasure and the pleasures of the flesh, that we can enjoy now, and the memories of that past we share. IG-88 and the shorter figure of Zuckuss came up on either side of Fett, the droid scanning the space with methodical thoroughness, the other bounty hunter glancing around with nervous apprehension. With a slower and more ponderous tread, Daharhan loomed up behind. "The past is over," said Boba Fett. The Shell Hut's wobbling face, protruding from the collar of the repulsor-borne cylinder, evoked a cold revulsion inside him. "If not for you, then it is for me." "I wonder about that." Gita raised one of the cylinder's mechanical hands, using the point of its claw to scratch a deep fold in his chin. "How much do creatures ever forget? I hope you'll excuse me for waxing philosophical. I know how impatient you become, but sometimes I feel that nothing is forgotten. Everything remains buried deeply or just beneath the surface, just waiting for its certain resurrection, to be brought out into the light once more." Boba Fett could decipher the meaning behind the Shell Hut's words. What he's saying, thought Fett, is that he hasn't forgotten. The reminder about the past and what it contained, back aboard the Slave One, hadn't been enough to indicate how fiercely that humiliation burned in Gita's memory. If one looked past all his cloying and ingratiating manners, the show of welcome here on Circumtorre, the desire for vengeance could be plainly seen and counted on. He's got his plans, thought Boba Fett, and I've got mine. For a split second, as Fett gazed back into Gita's broad, half-lidded eyes, he wondered if there was another meaning to what the Shell Hut had spoken. Resurrection brought out into the light. When one played a dangerous game, there was always the possibility that the opponent was one move ahead. Fett knew that in this game that would mean death. If he found out, mused Fett, as he searched Gita's massive face for any clue, if he's figured out everything that happened here in the past, then the game was already over. There would be no more moves to play, just the sweeping of the broken pieces from the board. Those pieces would include himself and the other bounty hunters that he had brought here with him. And maybe one more. Whatever happens, decided Boba Fett, as he gazed unflinching into the dark centers of Gita's eyes. Whatever happens, he's going with me. But enough of all that. The floating cylinder that encased Gita rotated slightly so that one of the mechanical hands could gesture toward the center of the reception hall. As you have so forcefully reminded me, this is, alas, more a business occasion than a social one. Let us proceed. There are others here who are more than eager to meet with you and your companions. After you, said Boba Fett. They're your species, not mine. Years ago, he had picked up some profitable merchandise on a backwater world where the dominant form of long-distance transportation had been lighter than air freighters, slow and immense, tapered ovoid dirigibles filled with helium and other buoyant gases. The planet's skies had been filled with the craft, like elongated silvery moons, their crew gondolas and cargo containers slung underneath their curved and shaded bellies. That was what Circumtorre's great reception hall reminded Fett of. There were a dozen shell huts besides Gita, the riveted cylinders floating on their repulsor beams, turning and bumping into each other with graceless sloth. At the front end of each cylinder protruded another bejowled Hut-East face, like a wad of some unpleasant organic substance that had been inserted in the circular metal collar. Some of the shell hut faces appeared younger than Gita, their large eyes glittering with avarice, slit nostrils flared by the trace scents on which their constant appetites fastened. The younger ones encasing cylinders were smaller as well. Boba Fett knew how the shell huts enjoyed throwing lavish parties for themselves upon the occasion of one's expanding bulk being transferred to a new and larger cylinder. With their artificial exoskeletons, the cylinders raised by repulsor beams, the size to which shell huts could aspire was no longer restricted by gravity, only by how much they could grab of the galaxy's wealth and stuff into their lipless mouths. Gita was only in the middle range when it came to sheer mass, Boba Fett recognized a few of the other shell huts in the great reception hall. Elders of the clan that were to Gita as an Imperial battlecruiser was to a TIE fighter craft. Those faces protruding from their cylinders' metal collars were so heavily waddled from brow to throat that hooks had been surgically implanted in the blubbery tissue. The sharp metal bits connected to a web of thin, high-tension strands fastened to the top edge of the cylinder. If not for that support, the old shell hut's eyes and nostrils would have been buried beneath avalanches of their own slack flesh. As Boba Fett and the other bounty hunters approached, the largest of the repulsor-borne cylinders turned majestically, like an interstellar luxury ship being maneuvered into an off-planet berth. A low voice rumbled from the gargantuan hut bound by the riveted durasteel plates. "I grow weary, Gita." The larger shell hut fastened the irritable gaze of its yellowed eyes upon its clan member. "You keep us waiting. And for what?" "Some of us may still be amused, but I assure you that I am not." Gita bobbed forward, the little crab-like hands rising from underneath his cylinder and making fluttery gestures of mollification. "Patience will yet be rewarded, your magnitude. Our guests have arrived at last. The show will begin in a moment." "Show?" Bosk scowled. "What show are you talking about? We came here on business." Of course. Just as your leader Boba Fett keeps reminding me." Gita turned his wide, wet-edged smile toward the Trandoshan. "Your patience will be rewarded as well, I assure you. But you've traveled so far, all of you have." The mechanical hands gesture took in all of the bounty hunters, and through some of the emptiest and least rewarding stretches of the galaxy. "I'd hate for you to go away from here after our business is concluded and tell the sentient creatures of all the worlds that the shell huts put out a mean and scanty table for their visitors. We have a reputation for hospitality to maintain, don't we? What would our fellow huts, our cousin Jabba, for instance, say if he heard that we had not provided for others' famished appetites?" "We're not hungry," said Boba Fett. "Not for anything that you're likely to serve." I think otherwise, my dear Fett. This meal is one that I've been preparing for a long time. A very long time. Since the last time you were here on Circumtorre, and things went less than graciously, for some of us. More complaints. The immense shell hut, his name, Fett remembered, was Nulada, rolled his yellow eyes beneath his brows, folded in sagging pouches. "Nothing but complaints," he rumbled oleaginously. "You've been obsessed for too long a time, Gita. Perhaps you should be relieved of even those duties that you've retained this far, so that you could take a long rest to clear your mind." A flash of anger showed in Gita's face like a lightning stroke in storm-heavy clouds. The crab-like mechanical hands locked their claws together and, as though preventing themselves from slashing a set of parallel bloodied furrows down the older and larger shell hut's face. "I've had time enough," Gita's voice was a snarling whine. "But let's not waste any more of it." "Come along, then." Even with just his own jowl-wrapped face protruding from the collar of his floating cylinder, the effort required to regain control was visible. The cylinder turned slightly, angling toward the center of the great reception hall, where more of the shell hut's encased forms jostled around a rectangular dais, surrounded on all sides by low, concentric steps. "Everything has been placed in readiness for you." The claws unclasped, allowing one of them to make a sweeping gesture toward the dais. "Shall we?" Boba Fett didn't feel like making any further conversation with their host. He led the way toward the dais, letting the other members of the bounty hunter team fall in behind. There were enough reflective surfaces scattered throughout the space, beams of polished durasteel supporting the domed roof above, that he could see Bosk and the droid IG-88 following his quick stride, with the Trandoshan glaring with suspicion and enmity at every one of the bobbing and floating shell huts. Behind that pair, the massive shape of Daharhan trod heavily, the inert laser cannon still impressive in its glistening darkness, like an emblem of latent destruction wrapped in trails of hissing steam. At Fett's elbow, Zuckuss trotted to keep up with him. "I don't like the looks of this," panted the shorter bounty hunter. "I don't like the looks of this one bit." He knew just what Zuckuss was talking about. Around the sides of the great reception hall, from alcoves and corridors branching off the central space, other figures had appeared, ones that weren't shell huts. "Mercenaries," said Boba Fett quietly. "In black insignialess uniforms, armed and watching." If he'd wanted to, he could very likely have identified more than a few of them from past encounters. There was always a loose assemblage of thugs and venal murderers, varying in number and quality, depending mainly upon who had been killed recently, and to a lesser degree, upon who was rotting away in the galaxy's various penal institutions, shifting back and forth among the less civilized worlds, finding employment as enforcers and private hitmen. The Shell Hut's distant species relation, the notorious Jabba on backwater Tatooine, usually paid the highest wages and got the pick of the lot, the quickest with their chosen weapons and the least encumbered by scruples about what kind of jobs they took care of for their employer. What else, Fett asked Zuckuss, did you expect? This many? Still at Boba Fett's side, Zuckuss quickly scanned the perimeter of the great reception hall. There must be a couple dozen of them, at least. He took another count, looking past the raised dais in the middle of the space. Maybe 50 of them. Gita told us that he'd been preparing for this for a long time. Without turning his visored helmet, Boba Fett had taken his own estimate of the forces arrayed along the hall's perimeter. He's obviously called in a lot of favors. This much firepower didn't come cheap. Most of the mercenaries cradled late-model blaster rifles against their chests. Gita must have provided the weapons, as they were obviously more expensive than the usual cheap and nasty if lethally efficient gear, with which mercenaries usually kitted themselves. These types disgusted Fett. They took no real pride in their equipment, the tools of their trade. If they did, they wouldn't spend so much of their ill-gotten pay on their own bad habits. He couldn't pay for all this himself, continued Boba Fett aloud. Gita must have gone into Major Hawk with his other clan members. But what for? Zuckuss's curved eyes reflected the ominous black-clad figures. We're unarmed. I know how Gita's mind works. Let's just say he's not given to taking chances. Or at least, said Fett, not after the last time I did business with him. Bosk had overheard the comment. I'm ready to do business with him, the Trandoshan growled from behind Boba Fett. Right now, his clawed hand hung close to the empty blaster holster at his side. Even without a weapon, Bosk looked ready to take on whatever army the Shell Huts had assembled, as though he could pull each of the mercenaries apart, limb from limb, with nothing but his own brute strength. Let's get it over with. It seems apparent, commented IG-88, that your desire in that regard is about to be fulfilled. Pushed along by his riveted casing's repulsor beams, the Shell Hut Gita had floated ahead of the bounty hunters. As they reached the bottom of the steps surrounding the dais, Kaida had already risen to the top section, where the cylinder bobbed beside a rectangular construction a little over 2 meters long and a quarter of that dimension in width. Its surface was draped with a heavy cloth embroidered with golden thread, the corner tassels loosely knotted and flowing down the steps. On top of the cloth were towering arrangements of exotic, off-planet florals, their brilliant petals thick and heavy as flayed Tatooinian dewback hide. From their stickily wet confluence, exuded cloying, opiate-like perfumes. Even through his helmet's filtration units, Boba Fett could taste the acrid molecules collecting on his tongue. They had no effect on the clarity of his own thoughts, but he saw how some of the Shell Huts gathered closer to the dais, the pupils of their eyes narrowing as their slit nostrils widened, deeply inhaling the laden air. Their lipless mouths curved into all-encompassing pleasure. Behind him, Boba Fett heard Bosk snort in disgust. He knew that the Trandoshan nervous system lacked any receptor sites for the flower's narcotic fragrance. Any scent less subtle than rotting meat was wasted on him. Lovely, Bosk sneered. Looks like you've got the place ready for a funeral. How perceptive of you! Gita had perhaps inhaled too deeply, though the scent appeared to have a stimulant rather than a soporific effect on him. Exactly so. The floating cylinder spun about, bringing the Shell Hut's face, luminous with toxic sweat, toward the bounty hunters. Ramping up the strength of the repulsor beams, Gita floated above the rank-smelling blossoms, the thick petals quivering with the unseen force. How often, though, that we fail to understand. The crab-like mechanical hands reached down and scooped through the floral mass, gathering the bright colors and pulpy tissues to the underside of the cylinder. For a moment, the crushed blossoms obscured the lower half of Gita's face. Then his ecstatic expression was revealed again as the gleaming metal appendages flung themselves wide, scattering the flowers across the steps of the dais. We fail to appreciate what a joyous occasion a funeral can be. The overripe stench of the flowers filled the inside of Boba Fett's helmet as the petals, bruised and crushed by Gita's mechanical arms, fell across the toes of his boots. He looked down at them for a moment, then kicked the flowers away. The heaviest of them left wet, bleeding trails across the inlaid floor of the great reception hall. "I don't have much of a feeling for funerals," said Fett evenly. He looked up across the dais steps toward Gita. "One way or the other." "Oh, but you should, you will." Gita's manner became even more frenetic and excited. The cylinder vibrated as it hovered in place, as though the fever of the creature inside had somehow been transmitted to the enclosing metal. Some of the other shell huts edged away from the central dais, as though fearful of an explosion. Gita's agitation had even pierced the stupor of those who had fallen furthest beneath the bloom's heavy fragrance. "I guarantee it." "Watch out," said Zuckuss in a low voice. From the corner of his sight, behind the dark visor of his helmet, Boba Fett saw Zuckuss's warning nod toward the edges of the space. But Fett was already conscious of what was happening there. Some of the black-uniformed mercenaries had stepped forward from the alcoves and adjoining corridors where they had first appeared. There were other motions of weapons being raised, the shoulder straps of the blaster rifles slackening as the barrels were swung up into firing position, the rifle butts braced against the mercenaries' hips. He could see Bosk and IG-88 turning their heads, scanning the details of the trap closing tighter around them. Zuckuss's voice sounded tight with apprehension. "I think they're going to make their move." Fett knew that nothing was going to happen, at least not for another few seconds. The cylindrical shapes of the shell huts were still bobbing and floating around, too close to the dais and the team of off-planet bounty hunters. Even as trigger-happy as this bunch of thugs was likely to be, they would still know better than to start shooting while their employers were in the line of fire. And besides, there was one more thing that he was absolutely sure of. Gita's little show wasn't over yet. "You wanted to talk business?" The shell hut's voice had spiraled up into a screech, loud enough to flutter the wattles at his pallid throat. "Fine! Let us do just that. But as you said, there's no point unless the merchandise in question is there on the table, right in front of us." Gita. The elder Nulata grabbed hold of the collar of Gita's cylinder with a metal-clawed hand. "Don't make more of a fool of yourself than you already have." "Silence!" One of Gita's crab-like hands furiously knocked away the larger shell hut's grasp. "You'll see as well, all of you." The faces of the other shell huts, protruding from the collars of the floating cylinders, turned toward Gita, some with expressions of muddled astonishment, others cruelly relishing the spectacle that was being played out before them. "You were all pleased enough when this scoundrel," the claw point of one of Gita's hands shot out, gesturing toward Boba Fett, "when this thief stole from me that which was to be my crowning glory." Both of the crab-like mechanical hands flung upward, indicating the great reception hall's vaulted roof and all that it contained. Gita's maddened gaze crossed over Nulada and the other shell huts. "Don't think I didn't hear your sniggering jeers and laughter. You were happy to see me fallen and disgraced, weren't you?" Boba Fett discerned now that Gita's escalating shrillness was due to more than the intoxicants released by the mounds of flowers and their viscous, oozing centers. Enough of Gita's thick neck had protruded from his floating cylinder that a thin tube could be seen, almost buried in the folds of his gray skin. The tube ended in a surgically implanted IV tap, a needle plunged and sealed into Gita's bloodstream. The tube's other end was concealed inside the cylinder. Fett could surmise that it was hooked up to a time-metered dispensary module, leaking some rage-provoking stimulant through the shell hut's central nervous system. Just as Boba Fett had already suspected, the sight of the pharmaceutical tube confirmed that Gita had prepared for this confrontation by chemically stripping out any sense of caution that might still have been lingering inside his brain. Suicidally so. With his having gone this far out of control, there would be no way that the other shell huts would let him continue living and operating in their midst. There was a line beyond which honor and the desire for vengeance interfered with business, and Gita was now obviously well past it. The others were getting there as well. A sense of panic tinged the air inside the great reception hall as the shell hut's floating cylinders collided with each other, reversing away from the central dais, then turning and perceiving the armed and ready mercenaries stationed around the perimeter. Some of the huts were obviously fuddled enough by the heavy, opiate-like scent of the scattered florals to have lost all reasoning ability. That was the main reason that Boba Fett had programmed the air filters in his helmet to catch and expunge those intoxicating molecules. More than that, he had paid hefty amounts to the galaxy's finest black market microsurgeons to have the corresponding receptor sites stripped away from the branching ends of his own nervous system. Whatever stimulation to the pleasure centers of his brain that might have been lost thereby was more than compensated for by the control he retained in situations like this. In his business, he couldn't afford the simple-minded hysteria to which the shell huts were already succumbing. From the corners of his vision, as he continued focusing on Gita at the top of the dais, he could discern the repulsor-borne cylinders slamming harder into each other, the riveted durasteel plates clanging like an atonal percussion section. The crab-like mechanical hands tangled with each other and clawed at the wide-eyed, panting faces of the shell huts as they twisted and spun about, rebounding in fear from the exits, blocked by the blaster-toting mercenaries. Gita was caught up in a spiraling feedback loop, his own overexcited state mounting as it absorbed the frightened lunatic pulse from the other shell huts. "And you were laughing too. I know you were." One of the mechanical hands slung beneath his floating cylinder suddenly jabbed toward Boba Fett, the metal shimmering with the fury of his accusation. "All the way back to whatever hole that scummy architect paid you to hide him in." Gita's lipless mouth had stretched into a frenzied grimace, far enough that a trickle of blood seeped into the milky salivation leaking from its corners. "That was a good joke, Fett, but the best jokes always come with a price attached to them, don't they?" "Ancient history," said Boba Fett. He could almost feel sorry for the shell hut, locked inside an account that he could never settle to his profit. Almost, but not quite. Sympathy was something else that he'd stripped from his nervous system, using the scalpel of his own transforming will. "We came here to talk about other merchandise. We're here for Ofnar Dinid." "Ah, yes." Gita's eyes grew wider and more maniacal as the IV tube pulsed like an artificial vein at the wattles of his neck. "And the merchandise should always be on the table, shouldn't it, before we can start dealing? That's how you want things, isn't it? Then by all means." The dangling mechanical hands suddenly shot forward from beneath Gita's encasing shell and seized hold of the edge of the dais' central platform. The remaining florals, oozing sap from their broken petals, slid from the top surface and landed wetly across the steps as the thin metal arms tensed, lifting one side of the rectangular shape. From the floating cylinder came a high-pitched whine as the repulsor beam engine strained against the additional load. That was followed by the grinding, tearing noise of decorative masonry being ripped apart as the rectangular platform came loose from the dais and tilted toward one side. Gita gave a final, convulsive push, and the platform tore free and toppled down the dais' encircling steps. For a moment, the panicked motion in the great reception hall ebbed. The crash of the platform at the feet of Boba Fett and the other bounty hunters had been loud enough to distract the fleeing shell huts from their attempts at escape. At the exits, still blocked by the insignialess mercenaries, the floating cylinders turned, their wide-faced occupants looking back toward the figures at the center of the vaulted space. Plaster dust floated up from the wreckage of the platform. It now looked like a coffin that had been shattered open in a clumsy attempt at excavation, the thin plastoid sides forced apart from each other by the repeated impact of the steps. In the midst of the debris, draped shroud-like by the embroidered cloth with a single broken-stemmed floral lying on its chest like a bad joke, was a humanoid form. Empty eye sockets gazing up at the reception hall's distant ceiling. Without even looking at the man's face, Boba Fett knew who it was. "There's your Ofnar Dinid," Gita's voice came from the top of the dais, gloating at the rubble strewn across the floor. "Not such valuable merchandise now, is he?" From behind Boba Fett, the elder Shellhut Nulata pushed forward, hard enough to shove Bosk and IG-88 to one side. The riveted cylinder scraped sparks from the unmoving armor of Daharhan. Fett looked over at the massive figure hovering next to him and saw that Nulata's face was quivering with rage. The silken lines holding up the rolls of fat above the eyes and mouth were shimmering like the bowstrings of an ancient projectile weapon. "This is madness." As Nulata shouted at Gita, he shook one of his mechanical hands, clenched into a compact fist. "Vengeance is one thing, we all desire that, but now..." The old shellhut sputtered with incoherent anger. Now you're interfering with business. That creature was valuable to us. He was credits and now he's dead meat. Calm yourself, Gita sneered at the other shell hut. Business has been taken care of. Perhaps not to your satisfaction, but to mine, and to the satisfaction of the Narrant System clan, whose trade secrets our late guest had stolen and was busily selling to us. I have been in direct communication with the unfortunate victims of Ofnar Dinid's larceny, and I encourage them to set a price on those trade secrets, not on what it would cost to get those secrets back, but on what it would cost to make sure that no one else would be privy to them. In other words, the price of Ofnar Dinid's immediate death. The clan made their calculations, named their price, and I accepted on behalf of the shell huts. You had no right to do that. That shows how old and senile you've become. Gita's sneer turned even more withering. You've forgotten that there are no rights, except those that you take unto yourself. The mechanical hands rose, claws curling into sharp-edged fists. Our treasury is richer now for the dealing that I have done on my own initiative. Idiot! Thick drops of spittle flew from Nulada's mouth. There's no way that you could have gotten a price from the Narrant System anywhere close to what the information inside Dinid's head was worth. Perhaps not. Gita's hands spread apart in a gesture of unconcern. But the price I got is paid now, and not doled out over some 20 years to come. Credits in one's pocket are worth more than the credits that might be sprinkled someday over your grave. An ugly smile welled up on his wide face, like inscribed driftwood surfacing in rubbish-clogged waters. A grave that I think you'll be in sooner than I will be? Silence! The roar was deafening. It came from Bosk, thrusting himself to the foot of the steps that surrounded the dais. One of his clawed hands shoved aside the floating cylinder of the elder shell hut Nulada. With his other hand, Bosk stepped forward and grabbed the front of the sprawled corpse's jacket, singed with laser fire and stiff with dried blood. I've heard enough of your endless bickering. He held the lifeless figure of Ofnar Dinid up in front of himself, the corpse's feet dangling inches above the tessellated floor. This is what we came here for? The corpse danced like a loose-limbed puppet as Bosk angrily shook it. No answer came from Dinid's slack mouth. The skin of his face turned as pallid and gray as that of the surrounding huts. With an inarticulate growl, Bosk flung the corpse back down into the rubble of the dais's broken platform. That creature's been dead for weeks! I can smell his death on him. Bosk's nostrils flared back, showing his involuntary disgust. Just as with huts, Trandoshans were the type of carnivore that preferred its meat fresh. He turned his slit-eyed glare toward Boba Fett. He was dead before we ever left the Bounty Hunters Guild. This is a fool's errand you've brought us on. The corner of one scaly lip curled in a sneer. The great Boba Fett, the master of bounty hunters, and he didn't even know that the merchandise was already worthless. Boba Fett had known that that accusation would come before long, and he had briefly debated with himself about how to answer it. I could say nothing. He was not given to explaining his actions and strategies to anyone, let alone a crude, rapacious thug like Bosk. Or he could lie to Bosk, tell him that he hadn't known or even suspected that Ofnar Dinid had already been killed, long before he'd assembled this team of bounty hunters to come here to circumtore. Or, I knew, said Boba Fett quietly. Why wouldn't I? I've dealt with these creatures before, and I know how their minds work. Especially, he gestured toward Gita, still floating at the top of the dais, when what's left of one's mind is eaten away with the desire for vengeance. Wait a second. At Fett's other side, Zuckuss stared at him, astonishment detectable even through the curved lenses of the smaller bounty hunter's face mask. You knew all along, but if you knew that Ofnar Dinid had already been killed, then there was no point in coming here. No point, growled Bosk. Unless Fett wanted to get us all killed as well. He tilted his head toward the perimeter of the great reception hall. The armed mercenaries had stepped farther from the alcoves and exits, herding the other shell huts before them. Is that it? Bosk turned his hard gaze back toward Boba Fett. Maybe you were feeling suicidal. Maybe you're tired of being a bounty hunter. So you decided to take some of us with you. That's why you were so willing to hand over our weapons and render us defenseless. Don't be an idiot, Fett returned the other's gaze. Or at least not any more of one than you have to be. You may be without weapons for the time being, but we were never without defenses. No one walks naked into the midst of creatures like these. No one, except somebody who's ready to die. I'll let you know, said Boba Fett. when that time comes. But right now I have other business to take care of. He raised one arm, turning it so that the inside of his wrist faced him. Between that and his elbow was a relay-linked control pad. With the forefinger of his other gloved hand, Fett began punching out a command sequence. "Calling up your ship, are you?" Gita had caught sight of what Boba Fett was doing. "Do you really believe that your precious slave one can get out of our landing docks? It's sealed down tight with tractor beams. And even if it could break away, what good would it do you? It's as stripped of armaments as your pathetic selves." Boba Fett ignored him. It was a long series of digits to get past the control pad's encryption circuits, and then another one to initiate the program he desired. That one was buried years deep in his memory. But on matters such as this, his memory was infallible. It had to be. In circumstances such as this, he wasn't likely to be given another chance. "Is it a bluff, then?" The taunting voice of the shell hut came from atop the dais. "How sad for you to think I'd fall for something as simple-minded as that. If you want me to believe that you have some secret plan that will save your skins, you'll have to do a lot better than punching a few meaningless control buttons." Standing next to Boba Fett, Zuckuss fidgeted and gazed with alarm around the great reception hall. "Is there a plan?" His eyes were like curved mirrors, showing the distorted images of the dark-uniformed mercenaries. "You have one, don't you?" One of the other bounty hunters gave up waiting. With a guttural curse in his native Trandoshan tongue, Bosk reached down and snatched up a long, jagged-ended piece of the wreckage from the dais's top platform. As he lifted it shoulder-high, gripping one end with both his clawed fists, a tiny strip of blood-stained cloth fluttered pennant-like, a scrap from the dinted corpse's torn and charred clothing. "They're not taking me down without a—" Bosk's words were lost in the sudden roar of an explosion. Its force struck Boba Fett, a surge of heat and durasteel hard pressure full against his chest. He remained upright in the storm, his own weight already braced against its impact. The visor of his helmet flashed darker for a microsecond, to protect his sight from the blinding glare. Sharp-edged pieces of debris struck his shoulders, then were swept on by the billows of smoke that poured out from where the dais and its surrounding steps had been. As the smoke began to thin, restoring visibility to the center of the great reception hall, Boba Fett took his gloved hand away from the control pad on his opposite forearm. The command sequence, keyed to the long-dormant receptor buried in the hall's foundation, had done its job. Perfectly, just as it had been designed, and he had expected it to. The explosion had caught Gita unawares. Also, as Fett had expected, and its force had sent the shell hut cylinder tumbling and crashing against one of the hall's supporting pillars, hard enough to dent one of the riveted plates and bend the column, its top wrenching loose from the vaulted ceiling above. Gita's eyes were dazed, bordering on unconsciousness. A rivulet of blood seeped through the rolls and crevices of his broad face from where the pharmaceutical IV line had been torn out from the vein. The plastoid tube now lay on the rubble-strewn ground like a dead serpent, its single fang weeping drop after drop of a clear liquid. Some distance behind Boba Fett, the larger cylinder encasing the Elder Nulata slowly righted itself, like a planetary ocean-going vessel that had been swamped by a tidal wave. The cylinder rolled from side to side as Nulata groaned in dizzied confusion. The silken lines holding up his face's obscuring rolls of blubbery tissue had all snapped. His repulsive Hutt-T's features, the large yellowed eyes and slavering lipless mouth, appeared and disappeared as gravity shifted the gray wattles back and forth. What was... A gloved hand rose from the tangled, still-smoking rubble directly in front of Boba Fett. The explosion had knocked Zuckuss backward, his breath mask covered with dust and gray flecks of ash. A few broken scraps of construction material, the charred remains of the dais's top platform, tumbled down his chest as he struggled to raise himself up on his elbows. "I can't..." Right now, Boba Fett couldn't give the fallen Zuckuss any assistance. The chaos into which the explosion had plunged the great reception hall was still at a peak. Past the settling billows of smoke could be heard the cursing and shouts of the armed mercenaries as the frightened shell huts gibbered and collided with each other, and their floating cylinders pushed toward the building's exits. That wouldn't last long, Fett knew. Even security guards as ill-trained and poorly paid as these would eventually be able to sort things out. He stepped over the struggling body in front of him. One of Zuckuss's gloved hands reached, but failed to catch hold of Fett's boot, and strode quickly into the center of the dais's smoldering wreckage. As he reached down for the shock-protected container of hardened durasteel that he knew would be there, a bolt from a laser rifle shot a fraction of an inch to one side of Boba Fett's head, then struck and sparked against a pillar farther on. Fett quickly turned, his muscles tensing to dive away from the angle of the following shot. There wasn't one. The dark uniformed mercenary that had come sprinting into the hall's center, rifle lifted, was felled by a long section of rubble swung level into his gut. His momentum folded him around the improvised weapon. The mercenary then collapsed onto his face as Bosk's clawed fist struck him with a vertebra-cracking blow to the back of the neck. Bosk threw away the piece of scrap and scooped up the mercenary's blaster rifle. Fett saw a look of fierce delight in the Trandoshan's eyes as Bosk whipped the rifle around, a level arc of bright fire cutting through the smoke and across the other mercenaries who had been foolish enough to move away from the security of the perimeter alcoves. That'll hold them for a while, thought Boba Fett, as he tugged at the end handle of the tube-shaped container, caught tight by the rubble collapsed around it. More laser bolts stitched the air around him with their burning tracery. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Bosk, standing with legs braced wide apart, squeeze the blaster rifle's trigger stud with wild disregard for the counterfire, now coming from all directions. IG-88, with the cold rationality typical of droids, had grabbed the weapon of another dark uniform figure that had been cut nearly in half by one of Bosk's initial shots. Crouching down behind the corpse and a jagged sheet of bent plastoid construction material, IG-88 carefully aimed and picked off its targets. Another sight had caught Boba Fett's eye even as he wrapped both hands around the durasteel tube's molded grip, braced his boot sole against the singed remnants of one of the platform's side panels, and tugged harder. As he tilted back, arms locked straight down to the tube, a laser shot sizzled through the exact space in which his head had just been. The streak of light temporarily set his helmet visor blind and opaque, so that it was only behind his eyelids that Boba Fett could still see the image of Daharhan, roused from his silent torpor by the sounds of combat echoing inside the great reception hall's spaces. As the mercenary's fire streaked past Daharhan, like a giant spiderweb set aflame, the barrel of the laser cannon, inert and silenced, rose upward, as though it were the neck and head of some primeval beast, taunted to madness by its captors. The optics of the cannon's tracking systems pulsed red through the clouds of hissing steam emitted from the apertures of the black metal housing. As the reptile-like balancing tail thrashed behind him, Daharan's arms spread wide, black-gloved hands clawing into themselves, trembling with their thwarted desire for destruction. A keening, wordless howl sounded from deep within the machinery, curving into the creature's heart. The visor of Boba Fett's helmet cleared as he looked back down at the container trapped in the dais's wreckage. Another tug, putting all of his weight and force into it, and the metal tube finally scraped through the debris, shedding flakes of rust. A dot of green light beside the handle told Fett that the container's seal was still intact, the object inside still as primed and ready to go as it had been when first hidden here, during the construction of the great reception hall. With a last dragging rasp of metal against metal, the tubular container came free. Boba Fett caught himself from toppling backward, then cradled the heavy object in his arms. As he turned, he saw Zuckuss pulling himself upright a few meters away. The disorienting effects of the explosion had obviously faded from inside the smaller bounty hunter's head. Fett could see the enlightenment behind the other's insectoid eyes, the sudden understanding of all that Zuckuss had been told before. Surrounded by the noise and quick glare of laser bolts, he even managed a slight nod of acknowledgement to show that he had just now realized what Boba Fett had meant when he had told him those few fragments of the deal that had been struck between a bounty hunter and an architect. An investment that pays off later. In a big way. Here! That was Bosk's shout from a few meters away. Another mercenary, braver or stupider than the rest, had come charging head down toward the Trandoshan and had actually gotten close enough that Bosk had taken him out with a single blow to the chin, swinging the butt of the blaster rifle around in an upward arc. Another jab of the rifle butt, right between the mercenary's eyes, had made sure he'd be no further trouble. "Get busy!" Bosk had reached down and grabbed a blaster pistol from the holster slung at the fallen mercenary's hip and now tossed it underhand to Zuckuss. "We could use a little help." Zuckuss caught the blaster in both hands and continued holding it that way as he pressed the trigger stud, sending a wild spray of fire across the reception hall as he rolled onto his shoulder, dodging the bolt that dug a molten gash through the floor where he had been kneeling. The added fire gave Boba Fett enough cover that he could turn with the Durasteel tube in his arms and sprint toward Daharhan, still howling in impotent rage at the glaring blaster streaks that laced through the reddened clouds of steam. Before he had taken more than a couple of steps away from the dais wreckage, a pair of thin mechanical arms wrapped themselves around Boba Fett's neck, their crab-like claws scrabbling at the visor of his helmet. Eyes starting from their fat swaddled sockets, the Shell Hut Gita squealed in maddened rage. Blood webbed his broad face as the force of his encasing cylinder's repulsors knocked Boba Fett off balance. Fett managed to remain standing. For a split second, he was lifted and almost clear of the red-spattered floor as Gita dragged him upward by the neck. Then he twisted around in the Shell Hut's sharp-edged grasp and swung the length of the tube-shaped container around into the side of Gita's skull. The impact left a trench-like dent in the gray, wobbling flesh. Gita's eyes went unfocused as the crab-like mechanical hands flopped apart, dropping Boba Fett. There wasn't time, as much as Fett might have wanted, to finish off Gita. From the other side of the great reception hall, beyond the erect, howling figure of Daharhan, a volley of blaster fire singed past Fett. With the container tucked under one arm, he grabbed the bolted seams of Gita's floating cylinder, gloved fingertips digging a hold onto the metal. Gita's dazed eyes rolled as Boba Fett shoved the cylinder ahead of himself as a shield. A frightened scream escaped from the Shell Hut's mouth as the mercenary's laser bolt stung and sparked against the cylinder's curved flank. When he reached Daharhan, he shoved Gita aside with enough force to send him bobbing and twisting into the crossfire that filled the center of the reception hall. The immense form of Daharhan reared above Boba Fett, the inert laser cannon shrouded by hissing steam, the heavy arms crucified against the glare of the mercenary's rifle fire. Above the cannon's barrel, the optics of Daharhan's tracking systems focused upon the helmeted figure stepping within range of the tearing hands. Boba Fett halted. With one quick motion, he unscrewed the end cap of the tube-shaped container. The seal hissed, higher pitched than the steam escaping from the laser cannon's black metal housing, as air rushed into the vacuum. Tilting the container, Fett slid out a fully charged reactor core. He lifted one end of the core in his hands as though he were aiming a rifle, then stepped forward and thrust it into the gaping hole of the receptor site in Daharhan's chest. When they had been aboard the Slave One, Daharhan had howled with the pain of an essence-deep violation, as Boba Fett had drawn out a cord just like this one. Now a sharp intake of breath sounded inside the throat hidden beneath the laser cannon's barrel. Daharhan's back arched, his segmented tail thrashing convulsively across the broken rubble around him. Every neuron and sinew of Daharhan's frame tensed and surged in sync with his accelerating pulse as the bounty hunter's fist turned inside the exposed chest, locking the reactor core into place. The pulse of Daharhan's blood seemed to shatter the barrier between flesh and machine as the indicator lights along the laser cannon's housing flashed in a microsecond from yellow to a fiery red. As Boba Fett slammed the locking armature into its socket, then spun and dived for the floor, the cannon barrel swung down from nearly vertical to aiming level. The heat from Daharhan's first shot scorched Fett's spine and shoulder blades as he used the corpse of another dead mercenary to pull himself to a safe distance. He found the mercenary's blaster rifle and held it to his chest as he rolled onto his back. Pushing himself up with one hand, Fett saw another cannon bolt, 100 times wider and more destructive than the other shots cutting across the great reception hall space, enough to rip a hole through the light armor of an Imperial cruiser, and more than enough to reduce one entire wing of the building to charred splinters. Through the rising dust of fractured stone, Boba Fett could hear the screams and shouts of the Shell Huts and their hired thugs as one pillar and then another toppled into the center of the hall, bringing down a section of roof and exposing the dark sky of Circum Torre. Daharhan turned where he stood, segmented metal tail bracing himself against the recoil of the laser cannon borne by his shoulders and torso. The cannon's barrel rocked back in its housing as another white-hot bolt coursed across the hall, scattering a knot of mercenaries. The screams of the shell huts actually diminished, their panic having increased to the point where all notion of escape had been abandoned. Tortoise-like, each one drew his head back into the safety of his floating cylinder. When the last throat waddle was past the circular metal collar at the front of the cylinder, a ring of crescent blades irised toward the opening center, sealing off the shell hut inside. The blind cylinders bobbed and collided with each other, pushed and spun by the blaster fire, striking their riveted plates. A few meters away from Boba Fett, a blaster shot went straight toward the reception hall ceiling. A quick glance to the side showed him that a shot from one of the mercenaries had struck Bosk at one side of his chest, knocking the Trandoshan off his feet and sending him splayed out on the dais' smoldering rubble. Fett swiveled the rifle in his hands and blew away the mercenary, a broken corpse even before he hit the floor. Another one of the mercenaries had taken command of the remaining dark uniformed figures. Boba Fett could see the man at the hall's perimeter, signaling to the others and directing their fire. The aim of their blaster rifles turned away from Fett, as well as IG-88 and Zuckuss. A concentrated volley singed the air past the three bounty hunters. Crouching down, Boba Fett turned and saw Dahar Han standing in the middle of the fusillade, like a watchtower braced against the onslaught of a storm. The blaster fires sowed hot sparks across the black metal, as though each hit was a lightning strike, seen through illuminated clouds. Dahar Han managed to get off one more shot of his own before he was cut down. The laser cannon roared, its massive bolt ripping open another section of the flame-scorched walls and scattering one wing of the mercenaries. Metal could have stood up to their fire even longer, but Dahar Han's flesh was weaker than that. The torso beneath the laser cannon's housing was now wrapped in bloodied rags. His knees slowly gave way and he toppled forward. The cannon's barrel struck the floor as though it had been one of the roof pillars giving way, gouging out a meter-long trench. He was still alive. Boba Fett could see the laboring of Dahar Han's heart and lungs, the rise of the blood-smeared chest forcing itself against the curved mount of the laser cannon housing. The black-gloved hands rose and tore feebly at the wounds, as though death were something that could be plucked from the torn flesh and exposed fragments of breastbone and rib. The cannon was alive as well. The indicators along the barrel showed an unblinking red bright through the hissing steam. All it needed was a hand on the triggering mechanism and the will to fire. Boba Fett threw away the blaster rifle he had taken from one of the dead mercenaries. Ducking beneath the fiery bolts crisscrossing the reception hall, he stepped behind the massive bulk of the fallen Dahar Han. With his own adrenaline-charged strength, he gripped the semi-conscious figure beneath the arms and half-dragged, half-lifted him up against the base of a broken pillar. A sudden gasp sounded from within the other's body as Fett grabbed and yanked loose the thick neural feed cables that had been connected to Dahar Han's spine, the hard-spliced socket just between his shoulder blades. The laser cannon's aiming systems automatically went into manual override status. Boba Fett crouched behind the black metal housing as the barrel swung upward and into firing position. A small screen tucked underneath the rear of the housing lit up, with a crosshair grid zeroing in on the mercenaries positioned at the far side of the great reception hall. The barrel turned slightly as Boba Fett's hand jabbed at the controls, seeking a specific target. The grid's lines narrowed in and locked on the one dark uniformed figure who had taken command of the others. Long-range thermal sensors and the laser cannon's tracking systems gave a clear outline of the mercenary behind a shield of bent and torn plastoid construction material. Enough to hide behind, but not enough to protect him. Fett hit the cannon's firing stud. The weapon's recoil trembled the black metal housing, its shock traveling all the way up his arms and into his own chest. The single bolt from the laser cannon took out most of the remaining mercenaries. When Boba Fett raised his head from behind the housing, he sighted through the clouds of steam, hissing louder now to dissipate the heat from the metal. The far side of the hall was gone now. The violet-tinged light of Circumtor's skies was framed by twisted structural beams, their ends glowing molten. Across the open plaza beyond the reception hall, the bodies of the mercenary commander and the ones who had died with him were scattered like broken toys. Inside the hall, the few that were left alive had ceased firing, pointing the muzzles of their weapons up toward the ceiling. The brutal effectiveness of the laser cannon had set them to reconsidering their ill-paid devotion to the cause for which Gita had hired them. A couple of the mercenaries, the smartest of them, Boba Fett figured, made a show of tossing their blaster rifles onto the debris-covered floor in front of them, then raising their hands above their heads. "Cowards! Traitors!" A hysterical cry came from behind Boba Fett. With his hands still on the controls of the laser cannon, he turned his head and saw the repulsor-borne cylinder of the shell hut Gita come darting forward into the center of the reception hall's ruins. "I paid you for results," shouted Gita. "Not for you to run away and hide." The crab-like mechanical arm shook in impotent fury. "Get him now!" The floating cylinder turned as Gita jabbed a claw in Boba Fett's direction. "I order you to—" Gita's words broke off as he saw the laser cannon's barrel swiveling toward him. His eyes widened in their fat, heavy sockets as the indicator lights glowed an even brighter red, as though they were points of blood squeezed out by Boba Fett's hands tightening on the black metal. "No," Gita moaned in sudden fright. The crab-like arms fluttered in front of him as the cylinder started to back away. "Don't—" He pulled his head back inside the cylinder's collar, which then began to iris shut. But not fast enough. Boba Fett pushed forward on the laser cannon's housing. Steam hissed between his gloved fingers as he lowered his shoulder and put his weight into the thrust. Dragging the still-breathing body of Daharhan along, the weapon's barrel lurched forward. The black metal muzzle, shimmering with residual heat, slammed into the vacated collar of Gita's floating cylinder just as the curved blades of the seal mechanism locked down tight upon it. Boba Fett shifted his weight, now pushing down upon the rear of the laser cannon housing. The barrel angled upward, with the shell hut cylinder attached like a ripe gourd fruit. When the barrel had reached its maximum elevation, Fett struck the firing stud with his fist. All eyes in the great reception hall, those of the other bounty hunters, the mercenaries left alive, even the other shell huts, who were brave enough to unseal the fronts of their cylinders when the fighting had quieted, turned toward the tapered metal shape that for a moment stood aloft on the black stem of the laser cannon. A few of the observers flinched, but continued watching as the weapon sounded snarling roar, only slightly muffled by the object clamped onto the barrel's muzzle. The sound of the laser cannon's bolt echoed through the great reception hall, then faded like the last thunder of a storm broken by daylight. Lightning had flashed, contained with the cylinder caught at the end of the cannon's barrel. It had burst through the seams of the bolted durasteel plates, sending a rain of white-hot rivets arcing across the space and landing like sizzling hail on the rubble left by the battle. When the light of the laser cannon bolt was gone, as quickly as it had flashed into being, the plates of the shell hut cylinder were singed round their edges. They rattled dully against each other as the cylinder contracted again. The surge of energy that had forced it larger, now only an afterimage, burned into the observer's eyes. Boba Fett lowered the laser cannon's barrel, and the cylinder slid off the end of its muzzle. The cylinder fell to the great reception hall's floor with a lifeless clang. Slowly, a red pool formed around it as Gita's liquefied corpse seeped through the joins between the plates and out the empty rivet holes. "Just as well," wheezed another shell hut's voice. The elder Nulata floated toward the dead cylinder. It looked like a mechanical egg, cracked but not yet peeled of its metal shell. The claws of one of Nulata's crab-like arms held back the roll of blubbery tissue over his eyes. With the other, he prodded the side of what had been Gita's metal casing. Silently, the cylinder rolled back and forth in the red mire. He had already made more of a nuisance of himself than he had any right to. That statement, Boba Fett figured, would probably be the extent of Gita's obituary. Huts of any variety were not given to sentimentality. If the late Gita had left any estate after having paid off the Narrant System liegeholder clan and hiring this band of mercenaries, though he had probably gotten them fairly cheap, the remaining assets would be quickly picked apart and swallowed up by the other shell huts. Nulata the largest bite. At the elder shell hut's direction, a couple of the dark uniformed mercenaries had come over and dragged Ofnar Dinid's body out from under the wreckage of the central dais. "Most distressing," said Nulata, with genuine, if predacious regret. "This is what happens when someone lets their emotions get in the way of business. We could have gotten a lot more from those parties with an interest in this matter." Boba Fett wasn't listening to the old shell hut. With Zuckuss and IG-88 watching him, the weapons in their hands lowered, he laid Daharhan's body down upon the floor. The laser cannon barrel turned and slowly came to rest, its muzzle scraping through the charred debris. Daharhan's black-gloved hands fumbled for the voice box, clipped to his waist. The rise and fall of his chest, pinned by the cannon's curved mount, was quick and labored as a single fingertip punched out a message. Kneeling beside him, Boba Fett looked at the words glowing on the box's screen. "I should not have trusted you." "That's right," said Fett with a single nod. "That was your mistake. You're wrong." The fingertip moved with agonizing slowness. "It was my decision." Fett said nothing. He waited for the rest of Darhan's silent words. "I can stop now. But you—" The black-gloved fingertip moved from letter to letter on the voice box's keypad. "You still must go on." The hand fell away from the box. Darhan's forearm struck the ground beside his body. There was no more breath or pulse lifting his chest. After a moment, Boba Fett reached over and switched off the last of the laser cannon's red-lit controls. He stood up and turned toward the other bounty hunters. "We're done here," said Fett. "Now we can go."